Throughout my faith life, there have been certain things that have helped to keep me going, to help me carry on, as it were. And I think one of the most important ones was this sense that from the time I started really having a reversion in college, I had a real trust in the church's teaching and in the church's wisdom, that she never preached anything without really thinking it through, without really going to prayer with it. And I think that's been something that's been always so important, because what it did for me was that when there were things that I didn't agree with or things that I didn't understand, I didn't just write it off and say, to heck with this, and just leave. Rather, it made me sit down and really want to dig in more to understand where the church is coming from with this, to understand that there's probably something that I'm not fully getting here. I don't really see the roots of this teaching, because there's so many things like that in the church's teaching, aren't there, where we see that and it looks like intolerance. We see that and it looks like, oh, it's just they haven't gotten with the age. But when we really look at it, we see that the church has very solid reasoning behind her teaching, behind the theology that we preach. This is the kind of sense that we should have as Catholics, especially when we read stuff like the first reading from today, from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. It's where he's talking to husbands and wives, and it's that one that we get really uncomfortable when we hear, or we see sometimes in the pews. I'll see husbands and wives kind of nudging each other. It says that wives should be subordinate to their husbands. That kind of thing wouldn't fly in the public sphere these days, to say that kind of thing. But I think that we have to look at it with the eyes that say, what is the deeper reasoning here? What is the Holy Spirit inspiring on Paul's behalf here? I think that the first line of this whole section is important. He says, be mutually subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. So what Paul is doing is he's making a comparison between husbands and wives and Christ and the church. And yes, he says that wives should be subordinate to their husbands. And that can be a scary thing, of course, because we know that as human beings, men especially, we can take things and just take power, and it's not a good thing. And then we can take advantage of that. But what Paul puts on the man, what the challenge to men is very, very great in this reading. He says that husbands should love their wives as Christ loves the church. Jesus gave himself up for the church. He died for the church. And so husbands are called to lay their lives down for their wives and for their families. It's only in that this can make any sort of sense. It's only in a true foundation of love in the marriage that there can be any sort of submission between the two, because otherwise we start to act out of places of fear. None of that makes sense. It's hard for me to understand this because I've never been married. But I think married couples start to understand it when they see, when there's true trust and love in the relationship, they can submit to one another. In any marriage, there has to be a mutual submission. There has to be a giving up of something to further the mission of the marriage. This is the new life that has been brought together. So I think today we can just ask the Lord to give us new understanding, to ask him to help us to do that research, to do that reading, to do that work so that we can better understand what the church teaches here, what the church teaches in general, any of those hard topics. Because for husbands and wives, this is important. This is where true trust and love can be founded. And for us as a church, we need to trust and love Jesus, who has given himself up for us. And so we must give ourselves up for him as well.